So several years ago, I found myself as a communication professor experiencing something that I thought I would never have to experience, and that was teaching on Zoom. During the global pandemic, I was teaching in my home, and my husband, who's also an academic, we were having to take turns in our bedroom. We had created this sort of pseudo-office background with our dresser behind us. And there was a particular time where I was teaching a class and I was really into it, and the students were into it as much as we could be into it on screen, when I heard a crash. In the other room, my 1.5-year-old had thrown the pizza bowl all over the floor. So pizza and spaghetti was everywhere. So I knew what was going on. And so I said, just a minute, to the students. And I ran over, picked up my son, put him back on my lap, and I continued teaching. Now, I was so focused on trying to be in the moment with my students that I didn't notice that my son had opened up the dresser behind me, the pseudo bookshelf, and pulled out my underwear and started waving it around everywhere. And I looked at the students and they looked at me and we all sort of laughed. We have all been in stressful situations, on a meta level with the world, on a micro level in our own lives. And in this time of stress, we tend to be focusing on really important questions like, what is burnout? And why does burnout matter? And what do we do about it? These are really significant questions. As a professor of organizational communication, I've been studying meaningful work, work as a calling, and burnout for over a decade. Now, although these are important questions, the questions that we should be asking as followers of Christ is, what is calling about, and why is burnout from a calling so important? Why does it matter? Now, here's the big answer. I'm going to give you the answer right away. The big answer is burnout from a calling is not just burnout, which is terrible. There are things that we know about burnout that are really substantial. It can lead to anxiety, depression, psychological paralysis, a sense of cynicism and apathy and numbness where really all you're doing is scrolling social media, scrolling your calendar, scrolling that to-do list, doing anything other than getting out of bed, getting out of your car. But toxic burnout is not simply, I don't like what I'm doing anymore, which is a terrible feeling. Toxic burnout, burnout from a calling is, I don't know who I am anymore. And this leads to something that psychologists call deep shame. Now, why does this happen? We have to go back a little bit. So what is calling? Calling is relationship with the caller. Calling is relationship with ourselves, the called. That's called intrapersonal communication. And calling is relationship with the community that we impact and the community that impacts us. And so calling matters. Calling, though, is not the goal. The relationship with the caller is the goal. Now, what happens when we get to that place of toxic burnout, or how do we get there? So those are important questions. Let's talk about it. The way that we get there can be a lot of different paths, and some we have control over, some we don't. We don't have control over situations like marginalization or manipulation in the workplace. We certainly don't have control over life situations that might lead us to the ER or to our knees in prayer, in weeping and crying out to the Lord. We don't always have control over those things. But we have control over two things. Are you ready for it? Here's the first one. We have control over the concept of workaholism. Workaholism is an addiction to work. Now, I know that some of us use that term as a compliment. Let's stop doing that. Workaholism is an addiction to work. It starts when you get these incredible opportunities and it feels so good. But then it's less about doing the work that feels good, and it's more about doing work to avoid the bad feelings when we stop working. Workaholism is a compulsion. It's an addiction. That leads us to the dark side. The other type of dark side is job idolization. Now, job idolization is a bit different than workaholism because job idolization is when we prioritize our work above all other things. It's when we use work as an excuse to not show up for the people that we love, that we're committed to. Job idolization moves the shift from the caller to ourselves, and it means that we are trying to control our calling. So those are the dark sides, and we don't want to get there because remember, it's not just I don't like what I'm doing, it's I don't know who I am anymore, because there's a sense of deep shame. I don't like this anymore. Am I not serving the Lord anymore? I don't want to do this anymore. So what do? Okay, so there are lots of things we can do. The first thing we need to do is to look at the concept of stress. There is good stress and there's not so good stress. Regular stress, we need that. We need that to get through hard situations. Maybe You've graduated from college. Maybe you're about to have a baby. Maybe you're remodeling your kitchen. Maybe there's a job promotion you're working towards or a campaign that you're working on. All of those things are good stress in the sense that we know there's going to be a deadline. But chronic stress is when we get used to the survival mode as a normal way of living. And when that happens, 3 things occur to our communication. And those 3 things lead us down the path of the dark side. You want to know what those are, right? Let's talk about it. So the first one is withdrawal. When we are in that place of chronic stress, when we are in that fight or flight mode, like a normal way of living, we withdraw. Now, withdrawing is not necessarily a bad thing. Actually, to withdraw is a survival mechanism. What's bad about it is if we don't communicate that we're doing it. So we've withdrawn to try to recover, but we're not telling people that we've done that. Can you think of a time recently where you have had a moment of withdrawing without telling someone about it? Can you imagine if you had communicated that? So withdrawal can get us in trouble. The second thing that can get us in trouble is reduced awareness. So when we're in that fight or flight mechanism of chronic stress, we have those horse blinders on and we are just trying to get to the end. But what happens is we have reduced awareness. Now, communication is both verbal, nonverbal, and written. And if you're familiar with the studies, about 70% of our communication is nonverbal. What does that mean? That means that when we are in reduced awareness, we are not noticing all of the cues around us that are nonverbal. We're missing out on the majority of communication, and that can get us into trouble. So withdrawal, reduced awareness. The third one is physical tension. And we know that physical tension can lead us to anxiety, can lead us to depression. It can cause those heart palpitations, the clammy hands, and it's not a way to live. But there's good news. The good news is that burnout is not a category. It's not burnout or not burnt out. It's a spectrum. We have a sense of healthy calling on one side and toxic burnout on the other. And what we need to do is to begin to evaluate, where are we on the spectrum? Why is calling burnout so bad? Because it corrodes our relationships. It corrodes our relationships with the caller and the called, and even ourselves and our community. It's not a category, it's a spectrum. We need to stay active in evaluating where we are, because as any relationship, it's dynamic. It changes, it requires maintenance, it grows and develops. Okay, so let's return to those guiding questions. What is calling even about? We know the answer, it's relationship. Why is burnout from a calling so bad? We know the answer, because it corrodes the relationship. There's this great story about a person who is walking along doing the best they can, and they fall into a hole. They're in this deep, dark hole, and they don't know what to do, so they call out, "Help, help!" And all of a sudden, they see a doctor walking by. And the doctor says, "Oh, I'll help you." And they write something on a prescription pad, drop it down the hole. The person in the hole is like, "Oh my goodness. Help, help," they say. And someone else walks by. It's a pastor. And they say, "Pastor, can you please help me?" And the pastor says, "Of course I can." And they say a beautiful prayer. And then they walk on. Well, the person in the hole is like, "Oh my goodness, now I'm really stuck in the hole." Finally, with one final sense of energy, they say, "Help, help!" And a friend walks by. And then the friend jumps down in the hole. The person in the hole says, "Why did you do that? Now we're both stuck in the hole." And the friend says, "Yes, but I've been down this hole, and I know the way out." When you are in a place of burnout, especially from a calling, it's easy to think that this is the way life is always going to be. My friend, it's not. There is a way out. And the good news is this: our real guiding question should actually be, how do I pursue a healthy calling? And we know the answer. It begins with relationship.